when we talk revenue
Pleasure.
collection, are we just talking about taxes?
No, not just taxes. It's the amount of revenue that flows to the government. Look, government, particularly poor governments in Africa, have development priorities that they have to fund, and the question is where they're getting the money. They can get it from donors, they can get it from borrowing, or they can get it from their own revenues. And the conference focused on their own revenues, where they're going to come, where is it going to come from.
All right, now what are we likely to see post the global recession? Because in fairly developed economies like South Africa, we've seen the tax base shrink somewhat as people lose their jobs and therefore not be able to participate by way of tax payments into the system. The situation has improved somewhat, but it's still a challenge.
It has been a challenge, and this has been a tough time for some African governments. I think for most of Africa, they had built up their buffers and they had been able to continue their spending despite lower revenue. With the prospects of a global recovery ahead, we expect economic activity to pick up, and we expect the tax base to pick up, the tax base to increase and to rise. But just letting economic activity alone take care of it won't be enough. Governments need to expand the tax base. In most countries, they need to expand the tax take in order to support the necessary spending like health spending, education spending, infrastructure spending that's really needed for development.
Let's talk about what you've just said, just by way of improving on the infrastructure for tax collection. In many countries, the basic source of revenue would be VAT and maybe corporate taxes by foreign investors in the economy. But just generally trying to find the people who are economically active seems to be a big limitation.
It is in many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You have countries that have a small formal sector, a large informal sector, and part of the effort has to be to broaden the tax base. With a VAT, you do that by simplifying the VAT. You have a single rate, not multiple rates. You have a sufficiently high exemption rate that you don't have to spend a lot of time chasing after small taxpayers, and you try to be as inclusive as possible. But the key to doing that is keeping the rates as low as possible, the base as wide as possible. And that's true across the board. Corporate tax rates, personal income tax rates is another one where the extent you can expand the base, increase taxpayer participation, you're going to have a broader tax base. But you've got to keep the rates low to keep that tax base engaged, if you will, so they can see that they're not bearing more than their fair share of the burden.
Just in terms of some of the areas where governments could start thinking about revenue collection, what are creative options available for governments? Because at the same time, you know, if they start introducing different layers of tax collection on top of corporate taxes, introducing dividend taxes, capital gains, those kinds of things, it could put off prospective investors.
Yeah, you want to keep, again, the key is to keeping things simple. Particularly in developing countries. A VAT rate, as I said before, with a single rate, a wide base is a good idea. Increasingly, you're looking at regional integration efforts. That makes trade taxes less attractive, and you've seen many African countries heavily dependent on trade. So you want to go to more indirect taxes, you want to go to personal income taxes, corporate income taxes. The more complex you make things, the more evasion you get, the more complicated it is to administer. You need to make it simple, make it straightforward, and make sure people know the benefits that they're getting from their taxation. That's the key. You can have the taxation, but they've got to see where the money's going as well.
I mean, obviously, you've raised two issues, and I'll start with the first. You mentioned trade, and as we look at broader regional consolidation, there is lots of talk as to whether many African governments should consider double taxation treaties, trying to simplify things, especially for countries or companies that are domiciled in one country, operating broadly within Africa. How complex an issue is that?
Well, first you've got to get the basis right. You have to have a regional approach to taxation, and then which means you have to have regional harmonizations. If there are differences in tax rates, companies are going to drive a wedge between those differences. They're going to locate where it's more tax advantage. So the efforts, for instance, those of the EAC, those of the SACU region, to a certain extent in West Africa, of harmonizing tax rates, of ensuring that trade taxes are collected at the border rather than at various borders, getting rid of duplication, those are really important. But it takes a lot of regional will, and that's been a real challenge for some African countries, to be able to sit down with their neighbors and say, look, we're going to do this together. Sometimes it means one country has to give up a certain type of tax revenue, another country has to give up another type. You've got to get together and make those agreements. Oftentimes you hear politicians agreeing in principle, well, but when push comes to shove, it's hard to do. So we very much encourage a regional approach to these issues.
I mean, really, in terms of the complexity of trade issues, I mean, these issues of harmonizing tax laws, but there's also other questions like tariffs, trade tariffs that exist within Africa, and incentivizing the free movement of goods from one African country to another, because ultimately it's the manufacturer on ground who will benefit. Is there talk of moving in that direction where we're not just looking at streamlining taxes, but we're also looking at removing some trade barriers?
Absolutely. In the EAC, the idea is to go to a free trade zone where goods can pass freely from one country to another. But if you're a landlocked country in the EAC, in the Eastern African Community, you're afraid of that because you don't have borders that are on the sea, and so you're not the first collector of that tax. So there's got to be a reasonable trade share or revenue sharing arrangement. So again, it's a complicated issue, but everyone recognizes the need for intra-African trade as a real motivator of economic activity within the continent.
You mentioned earlier on that, people want to see where their taxes are going, and this raises the notorious issue of tax evasion, where a lot of Africans, for instance, say that they don't see governments, using their revenues constructively, and so this whole issue of the African investor taking their money into a Swiss bank account. I mean, fable or reality in Africa just by way of taxes?
Well, I think as all these things are, it's part fable, part reality. You've seen countries like Tanzania, which has raised its revenue rate by about 6 percentage points of GDP in the last decade. And you've seen an increase in health expenditures, in the number of schools, and infrastructure. They're tangible things that taxpayers can see. And that's what's really important, that the government make clear what it's spending its money on. The other important aspect of this is it make clear that everybody's paying taxes. As soon as a small taxpayer sees some of the privileged few getting away without paying taxes, he or she goes, why should I pay? The big guy doesn't pay. So you have to make sure the tax system includes everybody. Everyone sees that everyone else pays.
And issues around getting municipalities to work well here. And I'm just going to explain what I mean by this. It's one thing to pay an income tax. It's another thing to start paying rates and taxes and levies for basic services and utilities. That's another layer of tax where it doesn't seem that African governments have gotten it right.
That's a really complicated area. I mean, in many African countries are going through a process of decentralization where there's a central tax revenue and they're moving it down, but they recognize at the same time at the localities there are all sorts of fees and tariffs. So again, the principle has to be a drive toward simplification and a drive toward paying for services. If a service is being directly rendered, you want the person receiving that service being paid, and that's often true at the local level. Again, getting that right requires a fairly complex administrative structure that has to be built up over time. So it's an objective that's important, and what I think we have to do is work gradually toward it. There's no quick solution for it.
And finally, very briefly, from the inputs at the conference, are you confident we're moving in the right direction as Africa?
I think you saw at this conference a group of revenue administrators from all over Africa who understand the need for simple taxes, clear taxes, and for a tax policy that's closely related to expenditure policy. Here's what I pay, here's what I'm getting. That's the key for the African consumer, the African citizen, to understand the relationships between taxes and services. And that's the key to good taxation and good government.